Good evening and welcome. This is the First Amendment. Historically speaking, this is our second program, and I would like to thank again the network staff and all of their kind help, and their professionalism has been invaluable as we attempt to add to the programming here at the station. So my name is Frederick Douglas Dixon, and I'll be your host today. And we will today discuss a very historical topic. And the idea of this particular historical topic has translated for years and years, and translated in a sense where we can begin to understand and look at this particular paradigm over a historical time period. Now, I want to precursor the idea of the paradigm. The paradigm itself is called the Negro question. And for those of you all who have never heard of the Negro question, I believe wholeheartedly in what we call functional definitions. So this Negro question has been asked and answered since what we would consider to be the first arriving, the first settlers, those who were brought here in chains from the very outset. A lot of folks would say that particular avenue or that particular thought started in 1619. Well, we can use that start, 1619 today, to get done exactly what we want to get done. So we'll look to 1619 to 1865 as those so-called dates of the transatlantic slave trade. So I want to go back to the idea of the Negro question. And it reads, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Now, this particular question has never been asked, posed, nor answered by the same group that it was asked about. So the idea of the Negro question has been asked, posed, and profited from the group that is exactly or diametrically opposed to those who it would affect. So again, I want to make sure that we have this correctly. What should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? So as we look to the transatlantic slave trade as our start, I want to be very clear when I say a really good way to look at history. The further you can look back, the further you can see ahead. And with that thought, we look to the Negro question in the very start, the origination or the birth of America, and how it ties to the transatlantic slave trade. So with this historical question, we want to add to the pot and the credence of American history by uncovering some of the little known or esoteric facts about the Negro question: who has posed it, for what reasons, and more specifically, who's profited greatly from the idea of this particular question being asked over the historical time period. So when we begin to talk about the Negro question in 1619 or during the transatlantic slave trade, we have to go and cover a specific time, but this question came out of a question from the same thought that was what they called the Indian question. Now, I want to be very clear with functional definitions that that particular group of humans were never considered or should be called Indians. These are the indigenous people as we know it of this land. So I don't want to use that particular term, but the indigenous group of people, there was an Indian question about what to do with this population who owned this particular land at the time. And as we look as far back as we can on this question and how these two questions fall in concert, we can look to the idea of what it has done to these two particular groups, but more specifically with the Negro question, what has it done to those of us who came in the holds of slave ships, not coming on the Nina, the Pinta, or the Santa Maria, but coming in the holds of slave ships as cargo, as ones who would indeed till the land and build the country. So the Negro question in itself in 1619, let's go to the question again, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Well, during that particular time, the answer, during the time of the transatlantic slave trade, the best way to profit from this particular group was to have them till the land, build the country, and let's make sure that we can be very clear, free labor. So the question is asked and answered during the transatlantic slave trade, how do we best provide the ultimate outcome of free land through the Indian question, free labor through the Negro question, to build what we know now as the United States of America, a superpower. So when we begin to uncover some of these historical dictums, well, things that have been taken as historical dictums, and those of us who will understand how to research them properly. And what I mean by properly is when you research anything, you should research your researcher and what they research for a desired outcome. So when we talk about transatlantic slave trade and the idea of the Negro question, we can go no further than to say that the free land from the Indian question and the free labor from the Negro question set America approximately 500 to 1,000 years ahead of any country beginning without those resources. So the Negro question, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? During the idea of the transatlantic slave trade, it was free labor. So how do you go about getting one group to work a land and till a land for another person or another group's profit while profiting absolutely nothing at all? That's when we go into the scientific stage of the Negro question. The idea of, we know that those of us who are scions of ex-slaves built the country from the ground up with their bare hands. But these were not people who were simply savages from some remote part of the world without any type of civilization. Oh, absolutely not. The idea of the slave catcher was to catch the very professionals, the architects, the builders, those who would be indeed able to work this land and create what we know now as the United States of America. The Negro question has been posed in every avenue of American life. We talked about its outset and during the idea of the slave trades, transatlantic slave trade, what it actually meant. But as we continue, the Negro question has been asked in the legal field. The Negro question has been asked in education. The Negro question has been asked in housing. The Negro question has been asked in society as a means to a social function, more specifically a social control. So the Negro question from its very outset was the question of human versus subhuman. The idea of one group being human while another group was less than human. So the Negro question, when we talk about the science and the psychology of the Negro question, it has so many ramifications that we understand in 1857, coming to the closing of the transatlantic slave trade, this particular question is asked legally in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, 1857. Now, Mr. Dred Scott himself was indeed a slave. And he was owned by several owners, but one of his particular owners was a United States Army surgeon. And Mr. Dred Scott, being as savvy and wise as most of our slaves were about the law, which they were not able to legally read, but always fell victim to, found out that during some of the places that he traveled, and he traveled right here in Illinois, he traveled through what they call the Wisconsin Territory, which was Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. He found that during those times when he was in those free states, he had a right to petition his freedom. Now, this goes all the way to the Supreme Court, 1857. And he lived in some southern states, and he traveled through some southern states. Now, the complication comes in when Dred Scott petitions for his freedom. He petitions for his freedom in a slave state, or a swing state. So let us understand that now, legally speaking, the Negro question has become a part of what we know as the fabric of America, even going back to the idea of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and those who created those documents. So with Dred Scott, which goes to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Taney, and I quote, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the highest law in the land, and I quote, he says, "A black man has no rights that a white man is doomed or bound to respect." 1857, the Negro question is placed in legality in history, still looked to as one who's less than human. The 3/5 agreement was all about taxation and representation. How could the southern states, here we go again, the Negro question, how could they best maximally profit with the idea of this troublesome Negro? Well, we understand that a status was given to those who were in bondage, these folks who have been considered less than human, but somehow, some way they need to be counted for the South in representation. So they came up with what we call a 3/5 agreement, that the slaves, that those who were amongst themselves humans around other humans considered to be less than human were 3/5 human, not quite human, a little more than half human, while they're building the United States of America hand by hand. And if we go to 1793, and we understand the idea of the Capitol being built in its second phase to 1803, we know that there were over 100 slaves that were paid, their slave owners were paid $5 a month for their labor. And now we have what you know now as the Capitol. We know that for a fact, slave labor built the White House. We know these things to be true. You can research them. But as we continue with the paradigm of the Negro question in 1865 as the slave trade, and that we know to be the transatlantic slave trade, comes to its legal end, the question is asked again, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Now, we're talking 1865 to 1877. This is what we call Reconstruction, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. You'll find them in that particular thought. So now, with the so-called idea of emancipation and the so-called rights of citizens in the 14th Amendment, we find that this particular group, still looked to as subhuman, has rights now, so-called rights, of humans, or those who had at one time been their slave masters. So as we look at the Negro question through just 12 years, 1865 to 1877, we find an anomaly in American history. And we find ex-slaves being able to cast votes, being able to be a part of the court system and actually testify. We've also found them being able to own land just for 12 years. And right around 1877, we began to find the black codes and Jim Crow taking over and rehashing and energizing and reinvigorating the idea of what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation. So the reversal of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment comes after 1877. So this question is being asked and posed again, time and time again, by the group who is diametrically opposed to calling this same group human. So the Negro question has a connection in religion, every walk of life. In religion, the idea of the Negro question is expounded, and it is Genesis chapter 9, 18 through 27. That is what's known as the curse of Ham, where the idea of Ham and Noah and his sons and who would be doomed to be servants for the rest of their lives. If you ever read that passage, you'll never find the word black. You'll never find any color designated for that particular position. The Canaanites were placed at the very forefront because of the idea of one of Noah's sons finding him naked and drunk and making fun of him. So after that, this particular group was doomed to be the servants of his brothers forever. But never in the Bible, in this particular term, never do you find the word black, Negro, or any reflection of a group of people. So now that's religious justification. We just talked about law and its justification from the Chief Justice of the land. And now we talk about a religious justification for second-class citizenship, continued peonage, and subhuman standard and status in America. The Negro question bounds itself again in the idea of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1897. Legal cases. This is what created separate but equal. Mr. Plessy himself, 7/8 white, on a train in Louisiana to desegregate the most popular way of travel, the rail cars. So Mr. Plessy himself was so very light that he was indeed looked to as a Caucasian man. He had to make it known to the rail conductor that he was indeed a black man, 7/8 white, very hard to tell. But here we are again in 1897, discussing what must be done with the presence of this troublesome Negro riding the railways after receiving so-called emancipation. So Mr. Plessy himself, and this goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and this is what caused the legal case, which defined separate but equal after Jim Crow, after the black codes, comes separate but equal in every avenue of life. As long as it's equal, it should be separate. So now we've gone from the idea of this particular group working the land, this particular group having 12 years of so-called nominal rights as citizens, to reversing the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment and placing legal and societal boundaries on what it is to make sure that this idea of subhuman atmosphere is maintained, sustained, as well as exponentially multiplied. And we see in Plessy versus Ferguson the idea of legal segregation. We also see the idea of the Negro question in the idea of the highest court again, another time. There's an additional time that this is going to the Supreme Court. So the Negro question in separate but equal continues. And we continue to go until at least 1954, when we begin to talk about Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education was indeed a watershed moment. It was indeed a very systematically skilled and concocted case by a group of very brilliant people. So when we talk about Brown versus Board of Education and the idea of desegregation in American schools, well, we have to be quite honest. Here's that question coming up again in education. What should be done with the presence of this troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? And wholeheartedly, the United States as a country, as a land, as a society says, although separate but equal is no longer constitutional, we still have the idea of segregated cities, 1954. Now, Linda Brown was a 10-year-old young lady at that particular time. And Linda Brown's father understood that there was a school very close to their home. Now, this took place in Topeka, Kansas, the heartland of America, not what we know as the Deep South. So these sentiments are not just per se, if you will, permeated in the South. No, this is what we call the thought of America. So when we understand Linda Brown being 10 years old in Topeka, Kansas, and her father understanding that there was a school very close to where she lived that was above standards compared to the school that she was being bused to across the country, it went to the Supreme Court, all the way to the Supreme Court. And we find that separate but equal from the idea of Plessy versus Ferguson is no longer constitutional. But we have to dig into this and delve into it just a little deeper for a clear understanding. And what we find is there's something called Brown versus Board of Education 2, Brown 2, which used the words at deliberate speed. So we will integrate, not necessarily, desegregate legally in a deliberate speed, which gave the southern states time to do absolutely nothing. So we don't find that which we call desegregation until Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So now, 1857, and what happens at Little Rock at Central High School, and one person that we should never forget is Mr. Ernest Green. Mr. Ernest Green was the only senior in that particular class. He was the very first graduate of desegregated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So the idea of the Little Rock Nine and the idea of Mr. Ernest Green being the first graduate are just historical points that we should talk about when we bring these cases up to have clarity and depth. So when we look at the Negro question, we have to go straight to the medical field. So we talked about education, we've talked about the idea of society, norms, values, mores, and we've talked about the idea of a connection to a religious justification. Now we talk about the Negro question in terms of the medical field. And I have to go no further, but two things I want to bring up. The idea of the Negro question in medicine. From 1900 to 1929, we're talking about the eugenics movement. And for those of you all who are not familiar with the eugenics movement, there was a movement through the medical field to say some groups of people should be able to, and we call them the better group, or the group of the better kind, should be able to produce, while those of us who are of the lesser kind, or those of us who are not considered to be upstanding, those of us who are not considered to be desirable, should not be able to fruitfully multiply and continue to have generations. So that is 1900. Here it is again. The question's coming up again. Medically, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? And then we continue, you all, to right around the 1930s, and we talk about the Tuskegee experiment, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where there's a place in Alabama, Tuskegee, where they were subjected, and these were black men, were subjected to the most inhumane medical science in the name of finding out a question during the 1930s, and it lasted 40 years, a 40-year experiment on what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation. So a lot of times when we look at how these things reverberate, how they multiply and fester, and how they still have a hold on our society right now, we have to look to the root, or what we call that the beginning, scientifically speaking, the beginning. And if it's proper, we need to go to the very beginning of it and explain it. And we find with the Tuskegee experiment that these young men were actually injected syphilis and then studied over a 40-year period in the name of good medical science. And the chief medical group in the land, composing of the top doctor, the general surgeon, says itself, this was good medicine. This was a good science in medicine's term. So the Negro question is coming up again. And the Negro question in its most public outcry, 1890, the first Mohawk Conference. The first Mohawk Conference takes place in the Usler Hotel in Mohawk, New York, where this is written. And they're having a conference about the Negro question. And one who was very much so a part of this particular Negro question was the ex-president, Mr. Rutherford B. Hayes, and I'll read you his words because we like to let the words speak for themselves. And he says at the very first Mohawk Conference on the Negro question, they were simply savages practicing fetchism, the very lowest of idolatry. They were slaves of the most revolting superstitions, believing in spells, charms, and inclinations, and having no moral code. They had no skill in any kind of labor, no industrious habits, and knew nothing of any printed or written language. This in itself diametrically opposed to one who has built the country. So I find this to be hypocritical at best. Now, I kind of want to move backwards so that we can talk about some of our more famous presidents and their thought on the Negro question. Here's Abraham Lincoln speaking to 10,000 people in a Lincoln-Douglas debate in Ottawa, Illinois. And he says this: I have no purpose to introduce political and social inequality between the white and the black races. There's a physical difference between the two, which, in my judgment, will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. And inasmuch as it becomes a necessity, there must be a difference, as I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong, having the superior position. That questions or that wipes away the idea of being an abolitionist or someone who's anti-slavery. So I find this to be very, very hypocritical of America. But as we know, America has been hypocritical historically at some times. So I need to talk about Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. He says this in one of his most famous works, Notes on the State of Virginia. Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in endowments in both body and mind. So we find this to be time and time again the question of what to do with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation. And we have indeed produced evidence that this question still goes on today. Now, as a parody or as one to provide light for you all, we have to be very honest. Not all of the great folks felt this way. I'll read you a quote from perhaps considered to be one of the wisest men in history, Albert Einstein. Two things I do pay attention to about Albert Einstein. One is the rule of 72, and the other is how he felt on the Negro question. Now I'll read this. There is, however, a sober point in the social outlook of Americans. Their sense of inequality and human dignity is mainly limited to men of white skin. Even among these are the prejudice of which I, as a Jew, am clearly conscious, but they are unimportant in comparison with the attitude of whites towards their fellow citizens of the darker complexion, towards the Negro. The more I feel an American, the more this situation pains me. I can escape the feeling of complicity only by speaking out on it. Many a sincere person will answer, our attitudes towards Negroes in the result of unfavorable experiences which we have had by living side by side with the Negroes in this country. They are not our equals in intelligence, sense, or responsibility or reliability. I firmly convinced that whoever believes this suffers from a fatal misconception. Your ancestors dragged these black people from their homes by force, and in the white man's quest for wealth and easy life, they have been ruthlessly suppressed and exploited, degraded into slavery. The modern prejudice against Negro is a result of the maintaining of this unworthy condition. We've talked about the Negro question today, and we brought esoteric light. And these things are worthy of our discussion and research with humorless fervor. So when we ask today, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation, I say to you unequivocally, the answer that is being crafted and has been crafted by those in power, the answer is genocide. I say again, the answer is genocide. Ladies and gentlemen, this information may in no means change your life, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain, with esteem and respect, Frederick Douglas Dixon, a distinguished man of color. Thank you.